So there wasn't anything in the very beginning. Creation was an act of will. God willed or spoke creation into being. Anger leads to pain. God does not want us to be angry because if we are angry, we'll hurt ourselves.
The beautiful part about the Bible, there's layers to it. It peels back like an onion.
The world now takes on the perspective of good and bad. And before, it was truth or falsity.
Dr. Rick Strassman is a renowned psychedelic researcher, best known for his book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which details his groundbreaking studies on the psychedelic compound DMT and its potential to induce spiritual experiences. Today, we're going to dive into his work from a more of a biblical perspective and going into the book of Genesis. And we're going to explore how his research intersects with spiritual and prophetic themes. He was just showing me a book. Dr. Strassman, what's the book that you held up? I want people to be able to get that one.
Here, let me change the layout.
I want to make sure that we have it available, and I'll have the links in the show notes.
Yeah, it's called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. It's my comparison and contrasting of the experiences of Hebrew biblical prophets with those of my DMT volunteers.
That's amazing. And your latest book, I saw you were on Joe Rogan. You've been on Joe Rogan, what, 3 times or
Twice?
Twice. And your latest book, My Altered States, was published in December 2024. And that one goes more into your personal experiences, both drug-induced and non-drug altered states, from birth to early adulthood. And you kind of apply 4 lenses to it. And one of those lenses is Jewish metaphysics. And so I wanted to get into today, we had talked about this on Exploratory Call, kind of get into the book of Genesis, because you're can you share with us what your new journey and what you're starting to write on?
Well, I've been taking notes. So let's see. I guess, back up even a little more to, why I started reading the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, I finished my DMT studies in 1995. And things with my Zen community and me ended the next year, 96. So I was really free to explore any number of things, moving forward from then. So there were a couple things I was looking for that I started finding answers in Jewish texts. One was an understanding of the experiences of my volunteers. I was expecting an enlightenment experience, no self, no time, no space, no thoughts, no perceptions, which was based on the platform I was coming from, which was a Zen Buddhist model of enlightenment. But my volunteers really didn't have that kind of experience. Instead, it was full of content with which one interacted in a fully conscious state. So I thought maybe there would be a better model in the Jewish textual tradition. The other was more of a spiritual, personal reasons. I had been involved with that Zen community for quite some time, but over the years was growing more distant from the teachings and the statues and all the iconography. Yeah, so I was looking for another model of my own, kind of spiritual needs, or, like a different model to, fulfill those spiritual needs. I was raised in a conservative Jewish household. Our mitzvah went to Camp Ramah in Southern California. So I had some familiarity with the tradition, but wasn't, serious about it after, 13 years old.
Yeah, I could imagine, when we look at the book of Genesis, because I want to understand, not just the exploration of it from you from a personal standpoint, but how did it begin to affect you? Did you at an older age begin to read the text again? Was it doing something to you?
Well, I stumbled upon a book at the Port Townsend esoteric bookstore. I used to live in Port Townsend, Washington. It was called Phoenix Rising. And it was a book by a Brazilian rabbi, Nilton Bonder, who wrote a book called The Kabbalah of Envy. And at the time, that seemed like an apropos topic. And I was just amazed at the sophistication of his treatment of interpersonal relations. It was a bottom-up model. You could extrapolate spiritual truths and spiritual laws by examining the relationships between people, if they're kind or not, specifically anger, revenge, grudges, envy, jealousy, those kinds of things, as opposed to a top-down model, which I would consider Buddhism to be, if there's no form, feeling, consciousness, or perception in the enlightened state, it all occurs after the fact. It's, more of a, download. You just see if you can extract relevant information from that formless state. The model presented in this book was more of a bottom-up approach. And I was interested in where these ideas came from, which were from the Talmud, which was from the Bible. So then I started to dig back into the Hebrew Bible. I didn't know, biblical Hebrew as a kid, so I bought several dictionaries, and I didn't really know where to start reading translations and commentaries, which took another 4 or 5 years, to locate the reasonable sources of the translations. Yeah, so that took place in Taos, where I lived for quite a while, and I started off with the Torah, the Saperstein Rashi Torah. Rashi was one of the major exegetes in southern France in the early 2000s. And so I started to take notes from the readings that I subsequently dug into, which were the other major commentators from the Middle Ages, all kinds of stuff, dozens of commentaries. And I was scribbling notes in the margins of my copy of Genesis, and after a certain point, there was no more room in the margins. So I figured I'd convert it to a Word file and see what I had, and it turned out to be a huge file, almost 1,100, 1,200 pages.
Wow. And so from there, I want to kind of get into, because I want people to be able to understand from your perspective and from your learning and your teachings and everything that you've done, creation, cosmic order. And I know there's two creation narratives in the book of Genesis, because I think we're opening a book of wisdom up that is needed now more than ever. And then I know it's said in every generation that. But Genesis gives us two distinct creation accounts, one that's cosmic and orderly, that we see in Genesis 1, and I want us to get into that. And the other is kind of more earthy and human focused. How those Jewish traditions or your teachings reconcile these perspectives? Do you see them as like complementary visions or remnants of like different cultures woven together?
Well, the first account of creation is more of a, it's like a general overview. And the second account is more detailed. Mm-hmm. At least, that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, it's kind of more of not so much of a how as why. That's kind of how I've looked at it. Do you view it as like order from chaos, from like the void of Genesis 1 to like what was happening in Genesis 2?
Yeah, well, a fundamental tenet of Judaism is that, God created things from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't anything in the very beginning. And so Genesis opens with, water over the earth, which was empty and void, formless and void. So I think one of the reasons that occurs is because we can't comprehend anything that is not space and time and physical. Mm-hmm. Can't conceive of it, you can't conceive of it. So the earliest or the most primitive point at which one might enter the world of the creation is through just formless water, a formless void. There's another model of creation from the medievalists that was based on the Greek idea of a pre-existing matter called the hyla. So that coexisted with God or existed before God, or God created that. So, but within the Jewish model, it's creation from nothing, and the first view of nothing that our minds can conceive is just a vast expanse of empty water.
I know creation emerges as kind of this act of divine ordering. And I know that's theologically, a huge point of God coming in and creating, like you said, out of nothing, but creating a divine order. What do you think this teaches us about God's nature? And how do you think it inspires us, even on a basic level, to kind of bring order and chaos? And I know your story of, trying to figure this out from this order to chaos of our own lives.
Well, there's a number of questions there. What was your first one then?
The first one's kind of more of like the divine ordering. He comes in and emerges as an act. He does an act of divine order.
Well, think, that creation was an act of will. God willed or spoke creation into being. If you look at creation, though, you can start to understand God's nature. Spinoza used to say, or said, at least my understanding is, you don't necessarily need to be a prophet to understand God's ways and God's attributes. You just need to look at nature, understand nature. So I think we could look at God's nature a number of different ways. One of the things that I found useful about Buddhism was the whole notion of cause and effect.
Hmm.
And there is no effect without antecedent causes. And those causes, at least within the Buddhist model, or the linkage of cause and effect, is believed, I think, to be neutral. It's just the way it is.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, you could look at the laws of cause and effect as reflecting the mind of the creator of cause and effect. And if you see that certain things have certain consequences, then you can start to extract or interpret those laws of nature as reflecting, the laws or the mind of the designer. Yeah, so for example, if you're taking a hike and you stub your toe when you're angry at somebody that you're thinking about, that's cause and effect. Anger leads to pain. So in other words, God does not want us to be angry, because if we are angry, we'll hurt ourselves. And so I think, that's a useful example, or a useful, way. Cause and effect isn't neutral. It seems to be directed towards encouraging certain ideas and conduct and discouraging others.
And I know in the book of Genesis, there's story after story of this. Do you feel like that's the sin? Like, especially when Cain comes in and introduces that, and then you have the flood. Do you think that sin nature, or that sin being introduced, is that the cause, and then the effect is, what happened during the flood?
Well, I guess the first sin, as it were, disobedience, to a request, or precept from God, would be Adam and Eve eating
Right.
from the
Yes,
tree.
yes, yes.
Yeah, but I think punishment even is an anthropomorphism of cause and effect. So if a person did the things that are being played out, that would reflect anger or love or helpfulness or compassion. But it's just the operation of cause and effect. Certain things lead to certain outcomes. Yeah. So the story of Adam and Eve eating the apple, or the fruit of the tree, it's actually not the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which a lot of people translate it as, but it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So once one eats of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the world now takes on the perspective of good and bad. And before, it was truth or falsity. So it's a step down, actually, from in one's consciousness, from the truth to just opinions. So the garden was designed to house perfect people of the highest spiritual level, and they fell. So it was as if they no longer really fit in, to the environment, and were forced to leave, or had to leave.
No, yeah, and I want to get into the fall. I think it's interesting. I do want to touch back to Shabbat or Sabbath, because I've heard commentaries and scholars highlight that the seventh day lack of a evening and morning close suggests like an eternal rest. Do you know how Jewish thought, or how you can expand on Shabbat as a bridge between creation and the world to come?
Shabbat, yeah. Let me open this here. Chapter 1. Yeah, yeah. So chapter 1 is a busy chapter.
Yeah.
Shabbat. Yeah, so yeah, you were wondering about the two creation stories. Yeah, the first is just an overview of creation, and after that, it goes into the details, especially regarding Adam and Eve. Man,
Mhm.
humans, which was the pinnacle of creation. Let's see. He blesses and sanctifies the Sabbath. Well, yeah, I didn't know that the day, the Sabbath, day isn't demarcated as it was evening, it was morning, or it was
Mhm.
morning, it was evening. Yeah, that's interesting. You're supposed to work 6 days of the week, and the
Mhm.
seventh, you cease, from work. You're emulating God in that way. The world to come, heaven, life after death is never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible.
Really?
Yeah, there's like the resurrection of the dead.
Mhm.
But what happens after you die? Do you go to heaven or do you go to hell? That never is discussed in the Bible itself. The rabbis, after the compilation of the Bible, spoke about it at length in Kabbalah, but in the essential text, there's no mention of what happens after you die, other than the resurrection in Ezekiel.
Yeah, I want to get back to Adam and Eve in this fall and human nature. Have you read anything about what do you view on like Lilith and those hidden esoterics and Eve as a goddess like Heba, or Lilith being the exercise first wife or being the snake and or what do you view all that as far as in these feminine figures?
Yeah, well, there is no mention of Lilith in the text, and demons or those kind of spirits don't appear until I think the book of Exodus. So it is there isn't mention in the book of Genesis. Well, so Lilith, the story of Lilith, that belongs in the to the world of Midrash, which is one of the levels of interpreting the text, which is to develop stories or to create stories that expand, unpack, make more entertaining in some ways the narratives in the Bible, which can be rather terse. So I've heard about Lilith and that after the sin, Adam and Eve didn't have intercourse for like hundreds of years. And in the meantime, Adam was having sex with Lilith and spawning demons. That's not in the text. And
Yeah, yeah, of course.
I'm not sure what to make of it. It's entertaining.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of how I view it. I do want to take it from perspective because I know with your many degrees and everything that you have, as far as Professor White's, the fall to me isn't just disobedience. What do you think of it as a rupture into consciousness, into self-awareness, into responsibility? Do you look at it like that?
Well, I think it's a case of free will.
Hmm.
The first example of free will having explicitly negative consequences. The decision anyway that one makes via free will. There's regarding the existence of free will, there's a saying from the Talmud that everything is predetermined except fear of heaven.
Hmm.
Like nature is going along on its course in a unbendable manner. Everything's predetermined in a way, except for your making decisions, which can or cannot work out sometimes.
Do you feel like I know you, and I don't want to get too heavy into psychedelics, but do you feel like some people have said that the fruit was some psychedelic thing that created this consciousness or self-awareness? What do you think the fruit was? Do you think it was just a tree?
Well, yeah, I just don't know. It was a tree in the middle of the garden. And it was beautiful, and it looked like the fruit was good to eat because it bestowed wisdom, it bestowed wisdom, or it bestowed something. Not wisdom necessarily, because they were demoted, but good to eat, pleasant to look at. I think common sense.
Right.
I, I, say hell, maybe, which is intuitive knowledge. Yeah, but whether it was a psychedelic or not, yeah, I don't know. You can speculate. One of the interesting things about psychedelics is a lot of people look for psychedelics in the Hebrew Bible. The manna was an ergot alkaloid. There was cannabis in the incense. But the existence of endogenous psychedelics in the human brain, DMT, is known to exist in high levels in the mammalian brain. You don't really need to look elsewhere for the source of the visions other than the brain.
Do you think that's where Moses and these prophets, Elijah and so forth with the visions that he had, do you think that's where it came from, the DMT? Were they able to tap into that?
Yeah, well, I think the visions and the voices, or the phenomena anyway, that seem like they could result from high levels of DMT. The visions and the voices mostly. Those would be mediated by elevations of endogenous DMT in my mind, at least theoretically.
Hmm.
But what causes those endogenous elevations? Like if you subscribe to the notion of prophecy where, God communicates with humans, there needs to be a way for that communication to occur. And what better way than visions and voices? So it may be like a top-down energizing of DMT synthetic apparatus At the same time, those visions and those voices are divinely sourced.
Mhm.
Just stuff that the person's making up under the influence of a drug. So then you need to extract the information from those visions, and that's the function of the mind and the intellect of the prophet.
Yeah, after the fall, we had Cain and Abel, and whether we view them as, being real or archetypes, Cain's murder of Abel is kind of a birth to civilization and exile. And then we also now we're introduced to envy, violence, and the human potential. Do you think this story encodes something more? Is it showing societal struggles? What do you view Cain and Abel as?
Yeah, well, the way that I interpret the text is quite literal.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, Cain and Abel were brothers. Cain brought a sacrifice, Abel brought a sacrifice. And, for whatever reason, which is not stated explicitly in the text, God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but not that of Cain's. Yeah. And then, Cain murdered Abel in the field. Yeah. And as a result, God banished him from, wherever he was living, and he became a wanderer. Yeah, and his offspring populated the world, began civilization, building cities and tools and, musical instruments and sheep herding and all those things. Yeah, so earlier on, before we started recording, you were asking if I, believe the events of the Hebrew Bible is actually occurring. Yeah, this was, and that's obviously the big question. Yeah, well, I have a couple of ways. Like I'm still kind of working on an answer to that question. Kind of consists of two parts. One is that at least in the early chapters of Genesis, I take it as if it were real. So in other words, like, and learned that technique from my DMT work, actually. When the volunteers would come out of the DMT trance, so they would say, this feels more real than real. And I'd say, oh yeah, sure it does. It's just a drug, blah, blah. But after a while, I performed a thought experiment as a result of people not wanting to share the most interesting aspects of their experiences if I was interpreting those experiences as something other than being real.
Right, right, right.
Yeah. So I thought, well, okay, if it's real, let's go for it. Yeah. And as a result, I was much better able to hear and encourage folks to talk about the strangest and most interesting parts of the DMT experience. And if you're looking carefully at the DMT experience, it's, quite consistent. There's certain things, certain information, certain visions which occur systematically, regularly. Yeah. So if you, deal with the Hebrew Bible, especially the early stories, as if it were real, as opposed to being, something else, archetypes, psychological, sociological things. But if you just take it at face value, you can really learn what that world is like. And it's quite complex. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned from it, which is unavailable if you're interpreting it as if it were something else, which I kind of, learned was a mistake if you really want to be absorbed in that information.
Yeah, it's kind of more valorizing it away, If it's just a myth, then then you're looking at it in a whole different, like for me, if I say this is truth, now I've got to take the time to do the exegesis and get the truth out and understand it completely. And the beautiful part, and I've always said this, the beautiful part about the Bible, I've always been introduced to it, is it, especially in the Old Testament, it peels back like an onion. I mean, there's layers to it. Like, and this. I mean, you could study each Hebrew word and get so much meaning from that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, the vast majority of the text for this 1100-page translation and commentary, like it's, 99% footnotes. Yeah. So the footnotes include, what does this word actually mean? What are the alternative translations and what's the context in which it occurs? You're getting back, to the reality though of the DM of the Hebrew Bible's world. I think it was all taking place in the world of the Hebrew Bible, wherever that is, like the world of the DMT experience, wherever that is. It's in everyone. You can go there. So I think if you assume there's a world of the Hebrew Bible which is objectively real to some extent, everyone is looking at it and its influence. It's as if it were historically real because it's influencing us. still to this day so much. And I think at a certain point, it imperceptibly became our world. It joined our world and became historical
You think that was done on purpose?
on purpose. Well,
You think, well, I mean, like, let's go crazy here. Let's say,
it's a crazy idea, but
no, I love it. I love it because is this an interdimensional bringing of two worlds?
yes.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, is this a bridge that's bridging two worlds? And then was there a divine intelligence that knew that it had to wrap it into this book to lay the groundwork for this dimension to operate?
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the course of history from a theological view, it's, reflecting the working of cause and effect,
Mm-hmm.
which was created by God and is sustained by God. So there seems to be some kind of directionality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and, the laws of nature were laid down in Genesis in the early chapters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the interdimensional fusing is a interesting way of putting it. Because there is like the first temple. There are archaeological data. The Assyrian,
Yes, Babylonians, Hittites, yeah.
the Roman, the Babylonian destruction. All that is historical. So where did it become historical, and when was it not historical in this dimension?
Yeah, that's interesting because, it's like what you said. Let's say I was in your study, I'm Jason Rigby, I'm in this dimension. But then because I truly believe, DMT, you're going in a different dimension, you're seeing different beings and all that. And we don't have to get into all that. But what I'm saying is I'm Jason Rigby in this dimension, experiencing something in another dimension.
Yeah. 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 And, when you really, kind of dive into the Hebrew Bible, you're really there
Mm-hmm.
because so many questions are raised, what kind of tree was it? What was the sin? Why were they expelled? What does it mean that, God was in the sound of the wind going through the trees at dusk or at dawn? Yeah. It's very interesting stuff.
How did he communicate with Adam? Like, what was
Right.
that like,
Right. Well, it seems like, verbally. Where are you? I was I was hiding. Yeah,
And then why is God asking, an all-knowing, omniscient God asking where Adam is? It's almost
it starts the conversation, and it
Yeah.
allows the person to explain themselves. Both.
Yeah, and there's so much goodness. And that's what I'm saying. That's why I don't think you can find a book that has more richer depth to it than the Bible.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you want to understand the world from that perspective, yeah, I think it's great. Yeah, I never tire of it.
Yeah, the same. It's always. I want to kind of get into because I just kind of want to do like a macro overview of Genesis with you. One of the things that we see, and I know this is to Judaism, is the judgment, the renewal, and the covenant. But it's so wild that we see from what happened with Cain up until the point of the flood. It didn't. I mean, I don't know how long that was, but we can see the world went pretty bad pretty quickly. How long do you think that was?
Yeah. Well, you could look at it, from the chronology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I could.
But I mean, it's like it went pretty quickly.
Like a few generations,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe 200-300 years, 400 years. That's just a number off the top of
Do you think that that's what happens when because it's almost like a zombie virus, like sin, kind of in the Bible plays like this virus and then goes out, and then now you have what we've always seen. As a child, I saw those pictures of the waters coming up and people scrambling up the rocks and the boat in the background, Noah's boat, and it's kind of like a reboot, a reset.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a couple of reasons that are given for, or that constituted the sin of the generation of the flood. But the one that occurs in the chapters about Noah is a Hebrew word which is Hamas of all things, and it means violence or robbery or destruction. So there's a lot of debate over what does that word actually mean, what's the root and what's the derivation. But it seemed like violence was a major theme,
Mm-hmm.
and also that the mating of the sons of Elohim with
Yes, I was going to get into that. Yeah,
the
explain that.
daughters of man. That's another event, which is contemporaneous or close to the announcement of the flood. So there's a couple of things, violence and interbreeding with the man or the sons of Elohim.
Do you think the sons of Elohim were demonic? Do you feel like that was destroying a bloodline? That's why he had to do the flood? What was this mass
Yeah,
reset?
I can tell you what others have suggested. um, Yeah, well, here, let me see. The sons of Elohim. Well, some people suggest that they're angels.
Yeah, because Elohim is kind of isn't it one of the names of God?
It's the second most popular name of God, or most
Hmm.
prevalent in the text. The other is YHVH,
Hmm.
the name. Yeah, well, as I recall, there's a number of ideas. One is you can also translate Elohim as judges. So they may be aristocrats, let's say. They may be semi-divine beings, could be. Yeah, I think, those are the.
I know some people believe that they were fallen angels,
Yeah, so angels is one,
and
judges.
we had giants and stuff like that during that.
Yeah, the powerful, like the elites and the lords.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those are the, four main theories.
Now, there's a reboot. God reboots, with the flood creation, but he has restraint and he does it with a covenant. And that's the rainbow promise that we have. What do you view that and how do you unpack the tension between judgment and mercy?
Well, God is a merciful God and God is a just God.
Hmm.
So I think we see that in how cause and effect operates.
Hmm.
Like if you do certain things, you're punished either by yourself or by nature or by other people. If you do other things, you're rewarded either good health or success or things. So if those consequences were handed out by a man, by a human, it would be called exercising justice or exercising mercy. But I think it's anthropomorphized in order to make it more understandable. A cause and effect is a bit abstract, but if
Hmm.
there's a merciful judge in heaven,
Hmm.
then that's easier to understand, but it's explaining the same thing.
Yeah, I know the word grace, especially in Christian theology, the word grace is kind of unmerited favor. So it's kind of that. And we always talk about, like there's the window of grace. I didn't deserve it, but there was this window that I went through, and God spared me or so it's kind of like that whole idea of judgment and mercy. And then, I mean, even it could serve as a metaphor for personal or collective renewal, I think, in our time, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting. I think, like every mention of sacrifices to God
Hmm.
uses, the name, YHVH,
Hmm.
because, that's the aspect of the merciful God. And if you're expecting sacrifices to atone for your sin, in a way, that's an abrogation of the laws of nature. If you expect, to be forgiven. So VH is able to perform miracles.
Hmm.
Bohemian, on the other hand, is God's attribute or aspect as the laws of nature, which are inexorable. And if the laws of nature are inexorable, so would be the laws of justice. So you're praying, to God, to the element of God, to God's merciful side in your request to be atoned for or to be forgiven.
Do you buy off on any of the Near Eastern myths or the poetic relics? Do you view them as poetic relics of like Leviathan, and Tehom and the cosmic battle? Have you heard of that? Have you, like that was during the time of the flood?
I think, the flood story occurs after, well, let's see, but there's, descriptions of a conflict between God and the forces of chaos.
Hmm.
And, that occurs in Isaiah.
Okay.
You God setting boundaries, for the sea. At a certain point, the sea stops and then there's dry land. So, there's a battle between, the sea that wants to cover everything. And God is saying, you'll only go so far.
Mm.
And the sea monsters as well. There's a battle between God and the sea monsters, which I think occurs in Isaiah too. There's a book by John Levinson, Levenson, which has to do with God's battle in the Hebrew Bible against the forces of chaos. The sea monsters were created by God on one of the early days of creation. So it's an interesting riff on battling with one of your creations.
Yeah, and I want to kind of step into the Tower of Babel because I think this is, from a psychiatric standpoint, which you would understand this human ambition and identity and what the tower critique. Like this human, he breathes and it unifies, diversity through scattering. What do you think the tower taught us? Because it's kind of a weird story, kind of.
Well, it's a weird story because I think it's misinterpreted.
Tell
Most
me more.
people interpret it as the dispersion happening because of hubris,
Hmm.
because man wanted to make a name for himself and build a tower that reached up to heaven. But if you read the text more carefully, like after the flood is over, God tells man to disperse and fill the earth. And in the generation of the tower, they just stayed in the valley of Shinar. And then as opposed to dispersing, so punishment, so to speak, that tower generation was dispersed as was the original intention. So the tower may just be a red herring. It may kind of exemplify pride and man getting up to no good. I think it was a case of not filling the earth after the flood, and as a consequence, mankind spread out as originally intended.
Do you feel like the tower was something that was advanced? Because people were living hundreds of years. Do you feel like that? I mean, Miles, we had Benjamin Franklin still alive today. Imagine how wise he would be.
Right. What are you wondering?
No, I'm just wondering, do you feel like the tower could have been something literal that they were building buildings even more advanced than what we have today?
Yeah, well, the archaeological, kind of, perspective is it was a ziggurat, something you could see from far off, and it was a massive architectural feat. So there was a lot of energy put into it. A generation of the flood. There are some good aspects to it. They all spoke one language,
Hmm.
so they could cooperate. Um, that they worked together on a common project. So in some ways they were virtuous, but what say those virtues too was questionable.
What do you view? Because some people will look at the, being monotheistic framework, because there's a lot of polytheistic things now out there, even your mention of nature and looking at nature and people worship nature, and I know from the Jewish traditions, everything is mono, and even in the scriptures, it goes to the name and Elohim as the sole creator. That's it. Do you think that it's wise to have a monotheistic framework?
Well, depends what you mean by wise. Well, I think rather than it being wise or not, I think it more hinges on whether it is true or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a tough one.
Do you believe, like, so even in like with your studies and the work that you've done, because you're a pioneer in this, you said that people believed that it was more truth. Would you say they said it was more truth than what the truth is here? Did they believe, was it because of emotions or feelings, or was there this deep knowingness?
Yeah, it was. I think it was an intuition. Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't a logical deduction. I think it just felt more real than real. So yeah, I think it was a feeling, rather than something that they figured out.
Because I always wonder, in the sense of like when you think of a monotheistic framework, it kind of strips away the mystical elements, and we're always drawn to those things, and most of the rest of the world had a poly view on things, indigenous cultures and stuff like that. Do you blend the two? Or how do you look at it? Or do you take a pretty hard line and say, God is God?
Yeah, well, the conversion or the morphing of ancient Near Eastern gods into the Hebrew God. Yeah, there is work that's been done on that, and like I have a book on my shelf, From Gods to God, which I have yet to read. I can't even remember the author right now. But I think it kind of digs into that. At the same time, I think there was a certain revelation
Mm.
to Abraham of the most recent iteration of God's manifesting itself to the human world, which I think remains still the latest iteration.
Yeah, I want to get into that because, from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50, we have this patriarchal narrative. And it's like a wild shift all of a sudden to we get solid right into the ancestors of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so what do you make of Abraham's covenant? The land, descendants, blessings, and then this establishment of Israel's identity as a chosen people.
Well, I make of it what I read about it in the text. God spoke to Abraham in Ur Kasdim and said, go to the land that I will show you. I'll make you a great people. You'll have this land. You'll have a lot of descendants. Yeah. So, that's just in the text. The interesting aspects or interesting, questions which are brought up is, why Abraham?
Yeah, exactly.
What about Abraham was so amazing? And I think that's very important question, actually. Like who is Abraham and, why, was he chosen? And, there's this huge, midrash out there on Abraham being thrown into the furnace and, smashing the idols that his father made for a business and things like that. But the text itself really does not explain anything about why Abraham is well, especially what prompted the call in the first place. Yeah, but you can learn what kind of person Abraham was by reading the narratives
Hmm.
and all those things that occurred in his life.
He was quite old too, wasn't he? Whenever before he
I
ventured
think
out.
he was called when he was 75, and his first kid Ishmael was born when he was 90.
Yeah, that's the crazy part. That story's awesome.
And Isaac was born, when he was 100, and Sarah was 90. So yeah, it's a miraculous birth.
You know, yeah, it's crazy, and it's a theme of family dynamics from here on out, in Genesis. And there's deception, Jacob stealing Esau's blessing, and then there's this divine providence of Joseph rising in Egypt, and that sets a narrative for Jacob's family settling in Egypt. Do
Right.
you feel why do you feel like such a connection? The Bible has such a connection with Egypt. Is there any mystical esoteric things that you have come to a conclusion on that or anything? Do you think just Egypt was just probably like we are in the United States, the prominent culture at that time?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think there was a lot of Egyptian stuff and mystical and religion and language and anthropology and all that. And the more modern commentaries on the Hebrew Bible referred to Egypt and its influence. Words which are similar, loan words,
Hmm.
certain ideas which were carried over and amplified, augmented from Egypt. So I haven't looked into ancient Egypt, to be honest. I don't know. Like I have a commentary that I'm currently working my way through, but when they do refer to Egyptian things, I just skip over it.
Yeah, I know on that, like we look at Joseph, from a Christian perspective, Joseph is kind of like Christ-like figure, and it's kind of a prelude to a greater salvation. And I know you guys look at that also as far as in the Jewish tradition, as far as, the Exodus, coming out of Egypt, coming out of bondage. Genesis, do you see Genesis as God's revelation of himself, greater judge, promise keeper, or do you view it as like humanity's story given to us?
Well, I think it's a narrative of God's relationship to the world, and especially to man, and especially to the ancestors of Abraham.
Yeah, because whenever I look at the stories, and that's something that's so amazing, even when you get it later into the Bible, into David's life, and man after God's own heart, and then he's a murderer, and he's all these things. Why do you think the Bible is so? This is what gets me with it, as far as being truth, is it lays everything bare. It's like it's not playing nice with the characters in it.
Yeah, the other day I came across an interesting comment to that along the lines of there's no small talk in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think its influence is related, to its reception.
Hmm.
It was received in the state of prophecy.
Hmm.
It's historical accounts which are relayed by prophets. Philo commented that the only historian you should read is, the historian or, the history that's, written by a prophet. Only a prophet can, retell history accurately. So it was a prophetically received text. And I think, when you read a book written in an altered state or as a result of an altered state, you can resonate with that altered state.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you read sutras by the Buddha, you'll start to feel in a meditative state because they're describing meditation very clearly, very accurately, very profoundly. So I think if you read the text of the Hebrew Bible, at least, you can feel a feeling of prophecy or a slight tingling of it anyway, because it's words received in a prophetic experience. So the prophetic experience, I mean, it's sought after, it's reinforcing, it might be quite helpful in everyday life. So I think it's the state of consciousness which is so appealing. But I think the state of consciousness just is the entry in, to the real heart of the matter, which is the message of the Hebrew Bible.
Mm-hmm. I want to get your take on this because, and your interpretation of this, because, a lot of people view the Bible as, and I do, as like the living word, and it's living, like, do you view it as like an ancient text that has some, valuable wisdom in it? Or do you view it as something that's actually living? And what would you define living if you do?
Yeah. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, texts are texts, or well, the Old Testament. Just calling the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament is kind of an indication that it is dead and there's a new covenant and a New Testament that replaces it. Like Passover's coming up next week, and Passover is a recounting of a story from the book of Exodus, which people who celebrate Passover spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about and singing about and relating it to current life. So that's an example of a text which continues to influence people currently alive.
Yeah, I mean, some people believe it as like living. I mean, there's a reason why it's number one book, and it always has been. I think even still today, it's the number one book. Whether we look at it as an ancient script, or I view it as kind of a guide. That I know that if I gain wisdom from these stories, especially in Genesis, it can help me tremendously in my life. Faith, purpose, redemption. I can see all those things. Why? I mean, Dr. Strassman, you've educated, you've done all kinds of things. You're a pioneer in psychedelics. You've written books on it. Why do you think, is it supernatural to you? Why do you feel like, why are you taking time, like, to study Jewish? Is it because of your childhood?
Well, I like the way that I feel when I'm doing it. It's like like we were talking about, prophecy. It's a prophetic book. It's written by prophets under the influence of a prophecy. Detailing the prophetic visions and the messages. The intent of creation, and so it's great. I mean, it's verbal. I'm a verbal person. Cognitive. You think about it. There's some real puzzles in that text. Maimonides, for example, the guide of the perplexed. I would spend a day looking at a paragraph that I just could not understand, and I wouldn't, go on until I understand what he was trying to say. I even asked, mentors, what does he mean on page 25? Yeah, like I'm invested a lot of time in it because in some form or another, it is quite rewarding. I think on a larger, scale, the message of, the text is important. It's enduring, obviously, but and influential, but a lot of people don't really know what's in there. They have these preconceived notions and emotional aversion and whatnot. But if you take the time and you put in the energy to study the message carefully, I think it's an enduring message. It's an advice, like a guidebook you were saying. In a way, it's a guidebook to the operations of cause and effect. If you do this, then this will happen. And it's divinely inspired. It isn't just made up. So I think there's both individual personal experience, which I find valuable, and also larger social one.
For me, it's God speaking. It's God saying, "Here's who I am, and here's why you're here." So what's more valuable than that?
Well, take your pick.
Yeah. Hedonism, so forth. Why? This is my last question because we've gone past an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Strassman. But why not? Made the switch from Zen Buddhism to Judaism? What was the reason why you're like, this is? I mean, obviously you have respect for Zen Buddhism, but why not just keep going in that Eastern tradition?
Yeah, for a couple of reasons. One of them was as I was getting older, I think my Jewish, genes were starting to kick in.
Yes.
Like all the bowing,
Mm-hmm.
like to big golden Buddha statues and smaller statues and photographs of the teachers and
Mm-hmm.
paintings of the bodhisattvas. Something began to itch. Like, why am I bowing to these things? Why aren't I bowing to the Most High? Yeah, that was one thing. The other thing was, so early on, the community of monks was very supportive of my psychedelic research and my, linking it to certain aspects of Buddhist practice. So, theoretically, abstractly, one-to-one spiritual, counseling, it was a grist for the mill. But once I started doing the studies and, writing about the relationship between Buddhism and psychedelics, that's, when I think it got a little too close to comfort or, for comfort, to the larger, Buddhist community there. Yeah. And they kind of had to disavow me. So, that was okay. Like it was obviously, painful. I had a long relationship with them. No, but it also, freed me to start, looking at other sources of spiritual information.
Do you enjoy mystic Judaism? Do you read any of those? Is there certain, what this is a spiritual podcast that we have, or do you just kind of stick with more of the traditional aspect of it?
Yeah, I would say, the more traditional aspect. Like there's a number of translations of the Zohar,
Right, right.
Bible of
That's like huge, big volumes.
well, the one I've got, I think what was written in the 1960s, and it's only like 6 or 8, volumes
Mm-hmm.
without many footnotes at all. And I read through that, and I enjoyed it, but it was very abstract.
Mm.
And over the years, I have become too abstract, and it can be kind of disorienting.
Mhm.
One of the the reasons for the literal approach or the plain meaning approach to translating the text is very grounded in everyday reality.
Mhm.
And and it's almost a mystical, like it's a mystically realistic or realistically mystical point of view, but it isn't mystical. It isn't up in the stratosphere. I'm more comfortable with the everyday, mundane interactions which are spelled out there.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And Dr. Strassman, we appreciate your time coming on the podcast. This was so much fun. I learned a lot today, so I appreciate your work. I appreciate all the time that you've put into and being the pioneers into research and allowing people to be able to understand themselves better. All the books that you have, your psychedelic books, your journey, we're going to have all of those in the show notes below. So we encourage. And your new book, what was that? It was out like in, oh, that's the new one right there. Yeah, such a cool cover. I love that cover.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's called My Altered States. It's an illustrated memoir of my own altered experiences from 0 to 22. Yeah, from birth to entering, the Zen temple. Yeah, so it's illustrated. A friend in Birmingham, Alabama, illustrated it. Merrily Chalice. Yeah. So here's an illustration.
So cool. Yeah.
LSD, and I went to a party, and there was all this fried chicken. And I laughed so hard I peed in my pants. So it's a bit gonzo. It's like Hunter
Mhm.
Thompson meets Sigmund Freud or something, or Bukowski meets and yeah, so it's fun. It's a bit heart wrenching in
Mhm.
certain points, but it expands, I think, the discussion of altered states. It isn't all good or all bad, and it's a number of different precipitants like hypomania, cannabis, alcohol, psychedelics, depression, any number of things. Yeah, and it's illustrated. Each of the narratives is accompanied by an explanatory on a handful of paragraphs about how the experience took place and what I got out of it, what it meant, kind of unpacking the experience from a more clinical perspective.
I love that. And we'll also put the two shows that you were on with Joe Rogan. That's where I first saw you and heard of you on the first episode. Was that 5, 6 years ago? The first one you were on?
It was when my book, the psychedelic handbook, came out, which was 2022.
Yeah, yeah. So that's yeah. I remember that. I remember you being on there because I remember you mentioning New Mexico, and I'm in Santa Fe, and I think at that time were you in Gallup or Taos
Yeah.
or
Yeah, I was in Gallup. I was in Gallup 14 years, and Utah was
okay, yeah, yeah,
15.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and now you're in Albuquerque. So it's super cool. Thank you, Dr. Strassman, for taking the time today. Higher Density Living, all our peeps are gonna go down and we're gonna order these books and support you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. A lot of fun.
Stop it.